Just a nurse. That's what the break room whispers when she walks in. Not loud enough for her to hear, just loud enough for everyone else to laugh. Captain Morrison pours her coffee, black, no sugar, the kind that tastes like necessity, and sits with her back to the wall. Both exits visible. Both doors within 5 seconds of her chair. She's been doing this for 11 months at St. Michael's in Norfolk, and she's learned that invisibility is a strategy, not a personality flaw. The scrubs hang 2 sizes too loose on her frame. Navy blue, regulation issue, the kind that don't cling or suggest the shape of muscle underneath. She wears her dark hair down past her shoulders, long enough to cover the thin scar behind her left ear, the kind you get from wearing a comm unit for 16-hour shifts in 120-degree heat, from being someone important enough to be in constant contact with someone else who mattered. She was. She isn't anymore. The fluorescent lights hum at 60 Hz, the same frequency as the generators in the field hospital where she stopped existing. 3 years ago. Exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days ago. Not that she's counting. The Pentagon counted for her. They erased the count, classified it, sealed it in a folder stamped in red with words that still mean nothing to anyone on this unit except Katie, who reads them in her sleep. Dr. Pierce arrives for morning rounds at 7:04 a.m., and Katie feels the shift in air pressure before she sees him. His lab coat is so crisp it could cut, white as fresh snow, pressed with the kind of precision that comes from a dry cleaner who charges by the pleat. He moves through the ward with the stride of a man who has never questioned whether the room belongs to him. His eyes pass over nurses like they're part of the furniture. His smile appears when he needs it and disappears just as fast, leaving no evidence it was ever real. Katie finishes her morning vitals, blood pressure, heart rate, O2 saturation, and documents them in the electronic system with the efficiency of someone who knows exactly what matters and what doesn't. The data flows, 118/76, 62 beats per minute, 98%. Normal. Stable. The word tastes like a lie when applied to anything in this hospital. She's learned that normal is negotiable. Stable is temporary. Everything changes when someone decides it should. She moves through the supply closet during her break, counting morphine vials in sets of 17. Not because the protocol asks for sets of 17. Because when you carry a combat medic's aid bag, you carry exactly 17 units of morphine for a patrol of that size. You learn what number means survival. You learn to count in combat loads. The habit doesn't leave your hands even when your identity does. The faded unit patch is sewn inside her jacket lining, hidden behind the interior pocket where civilians wouldn't think to look. Tikrit insignia. 3-letter call sign that doesn't belong to anyone anymore. She touches it once before each shift, the way people touch crosses or prayer beads or photographs. A talisman. A proof that she existed. That she did something that mattered enough to be buried so deep that the paperwork has paperwork. The admission alert comes through at 11:27 a.m. Trauma to the ICU. Sucking chest wound, Tikrit origin, Navy SEAL medic. The name on the chart is Webb, Marcus. Age 28. Blood type O negative. The unit designation makes her hand freeze on the tablet for exactly 2 seconds before her training reasserts itself. The breath comes back. The eyes refocus. The hand steady. She signs her name on the electronic roster and walks away with the kind of precision that suggests she has somewhere else to be. She doesn't. She never does. But that wasn't the worst part. The unit designation next to Webb's name isn't just any SEAL team. It's the one she would have reported to. The one she trained with for the 3 years before the Pentagon made her a ghost. His file says he's carrying classified credentials from a theater she helped map. His chart says he inherited equipment. His team designation says what she already knows, he's the medic who replaced her. He's carrying her call sign now. He's wearing her responsibility in a different body, and the weight of it shows in the way the ventilator labors every 90 seconds, in the way his oxygen saturation hovers at 94% like a held breath. Katie checks the ICU schedule. 3rd shift tonight. She can feel the decision settling into her bones before the conscious part of her mind catches up, the part that still thinks like a captain, even though that rank doesn't exist in these hallways. The part that counts lives saved in sets of 17 and knows what happens when you look away from patients who matter. She moves through the afternoon rounds like smoke, present but not quite visible, answering questions with minimum words and maximum efficiency. Yes, doctor. Of course, doctor. Right away, doctor. The voice she uses in front of Dr. Pierce is pitched low, deferential, the kind of tone that makes people forget you have a spine underneath those oversized scrubs. She's gotten very good at disappearing into her own voice. Dr. Pierce appears near the medication dispensing cabinet at 2:15 p.m., and Katie's muscles tense in that way that has nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognizing a predator. He's watching her. Not directly. Not in a way that would be unprofessional. But the kind of watching that predators do when they sense something unfamiliar in their territory. Something that doesn't quite fit the ecosystem of the ward. Medications all secured. His voice sits somewhere between friendly and dangerous, the way voices do when they belong to men who've learned that civility is more threatening than rage. Katie's hands don't tremble as she closes the cabinet. They've been trained not to. All accounted for, doctor. Good. We need precision here. Attention to detail. His smile appears. His eyes move past her to the next nurse. Not everyone has the focus for this kind of work. The words don't stick into her skin the way they're designed to. They slide past like water against something sealed. But she catalogues them anyway. She catalogues the way his eyes settle on her for just a fraction too long. The way he's measuring something. Deciding something. Noticing that she doesn't quite belong in the category of nurses he's sorted into this ward, and that's a problem worth paying attention to. Katie finishes her shift at 7 p.m. and sits in her car in the parking lot, engine off, rain beginning to hammer the windshield like applause that nobody asked for. The faded unit patch is still hidden inside her jacket. The call sign is still sealed in classified documents. The captain's rank still exists in a footnote that the Pentagon has spent 3 years ensuring nobody will ever find. She stares through the rain and watches the hospital's main entrance, the way people move in and out like cells through a membrane, carrying their ordinary lives and their ordinary problems, and none of them knowing that they're standing near someone who used to save 17 lives before breakfast. The next shift approaches like a threshold. She arrives at 10:53 p.m., and the ICU smells like antiseptic and something else, the copper and salt smell of bleeding that never quite washes out of a building, no matter how many gallons of industrial cleaner they use. Webb is in room 3B, the monitors creating their endless conversation in beeps and soft hydraulic sighs. His chest rises and falls with the ventilator's rhythm. His oxygen saturation reads 94%. His heart rate is elevated at 102 beats per minute, the kind of sustained tachycardia that suggests his body knows something his conscious mind hasn't processed yet. Katie stands in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds. That's all the time she allows herself. 3 seconds to recognize the man who inherited her call sign. 3 seconds to see the weight that classified operations place on a human spine. 3 seconds to make the decision that every instinct she has, the ones trained into her in 3 years of being someone who mattered, the ones the Pentagon tried to erase, is screaming at her to make. She steps into the room and begins her rounds. She will stay until dawn. She will check his vitals every 4 hours. She will adjust the ventilator settings with the precision of someone who knows what 7% more oxygen means when the lungs are already failing. She will do everything that a nurse is supposed to do and nothing that a captain would do, because doing anything more would be asking questions that nobody is allowed to ask. But that doesn't mean she's not watching. That doesn't mean she isn't waiting. That doesn't mean she's forgotten who she is, even if everyone else has. The medication discrepancy caught her eye at 0340 hours, which meant it had probably been sitting in room 4A since the previous shift change, a small mathematical error that most nurses would never notice because they weren't trained to cross-reference billing codes against actual pharmaceutical dispensing. Katie checked the chart first, then the medication cabinet, then the patient's insurance paperwork clipped to the bedside monitor. Nexium, prescribed. Omeprazole, delivered. Same drug, different price point. The veteran in for a man named Garrett with shrapnel scars running down his neck like a map of somewhere worse than here, was unconscious, his VA benefits paperwork open on the rolling table beside him, showing a claim for $427 worth of brand-name proton pump inhibitor when the generic equivalent had cost the hospital $18 to stock and dispense. She walked to the nurse's station during the morning shift change, when the corridor was thick with families waiting for updates and residents shuffling between rounds, when Pierce was most likely to be visible and therefore most likely to hear her if she was quiet about it. She approached him while he was signing off on a chart, her voice pitched low, professional, the tone of a nurse reporting a discrepancy to a superior, which was exactly what this should have been. Dr. Pierce, I noticed the Nexium order for 4A, but pharmacy delivered omeprazole. Same therapeutic effect, identical dosing, but the insurance billing shows the brand name. We should correct it before the VA audit cycle picks it up. His pen stopped moving. His jaw tightened. He turned toward her with the kind of slowness that meant he'd already decided what kind of conversation this was going to be, and it wasn't going to be the professional kind. Nurse Morrison, when you complete medical school and a residency, you can question my clinical decisions. His voice carried across the station like he'd calculated exactly how loud it needed to be for the maximum audience. Until then, stay in your lane. The pen returned to the chart with deliberate pressure, the nib pressing hard enough that Katie could hear the scratching sound it made against the paper. Garrett's daughter stood 3 feet away, waiting to ask about discharge planning, and Pierce turned to her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I apologize. Some of our newer nurses don't understand the difference between medical judgment and inventory management. The daughter looked at Katie with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment, the kind of look that made it clear she'd just witnessed a professional dressing down, a corrective moment, a nurse being put in her place by her attending physician in front of a family member. Katie's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a muscle flexing beneath her skin for exactly 1 second, and then her face settled back into professional neutrality. She turned away from the nurse's station with her chart tucked against her chest, her movement smooth and unhurried, giving Pierce nothing to work with, no visible anger or shame or frustration. That was the mistake. That was what made him decide she needed to be addressed more formally. The write-up appeared on the unit communication board the next morning, printed on hospital letterhead, signed by Dr. Pierce with a CC to the hospital administrator. The document was short, precise, and devastating in its simplicity, insubordination and protocol violations. Nurse Katie Morrison questioned attending physicians' medication orders in a public setting, creating confusion and undermining clinical authority in front of patient family members. This represents a pattern of boundary issues requiring formal intervention and supervised practice. It was positioned directly beneath the cafeteria menu and a reminder about continuing education credits, visible to everyone, the kind of public documentation that transformed a single incident into an official narrative. By noon, 3 different nurses had mentioned it to her in passing, not quite meeting her eyes, their voices dropping into that particular register that meant they were uncomfortable but not uncomfortable enough to stand with her. The break room cleared whenever she sat down for lunch 2 days later, and it wasn't subtle. She'd pulled her sandwich from the refrigerator, opened it on the small Formica table by the window, and within 30 seconds, Sarah, the newest nurse on the unit, the one who'd actually seemed friendly during orientation, suddenly remembered she had charting to finish, and Martinez mentioned a phone call he needed to make, and Jackson's pager went off with a timing that seemed far too convenient. Katie ate her turkey sandwich with measured bites, her hands as steady as if she were starting in 4-line, her face blank as hospital ceiling tiles, and said nothing to anyone. The isolation was professional. It was systematic. It was designed to communicate to the entire unit that associating with Katie Morrison carried a social cost. That's when the emails started. Pierce CC'd the hospital administrator on everything, building a documentation trail that read like evidence of escalating incompetence. Administrator copied on concern regarding Nurse Morrison's handling of controlled substance inventory. She questioned the count for morphine without consulting charge nurse first. 3 days later, administrator copied on incident where Nurse Morrison made unsolicited recommendation about patient pain management protocol, suggests concerning pattern of scope creep. Most of the complaints were fabricated or widely stretched interpretations of routine conversations, the kind of documentation that would survive a casual review but dissolve under scrutiny. Katie knew the pattern. She'd seen it before, in military contexts, where officers started building cases against soldiers they wanted gone, establishing the appearance of a legitimate paper trail before the firing came. Pierce had weaponized institutional process, had learned the rhythm of documentation, had turned the hospital's own protective mechanisms into a tool of extraction. He found her outside the medication room on the evening of day 5, when the hallway was nearly empty, his voice dropping into that particular register that meant he was trying to be helpful, which was always more dangerous than when he was being cruel. "Katie, I'm trying to help you here. You're talented, but you have a problem with authority." His hand touched her shoulder, a gesture meant to look paternal, protective. "I've seen it destroy careers. I've seen bright nurses wash out because they couldn't accept the hierarchy. Let me mentor you through this before it gets worse." She thanked him, her voice utterly flat, the tone of someone thanking a barista for a coffee, and returned to the medication room without meeting his eyes. He stood in the hallway for a moment, waiting for something, a reaction, a breakdown, some sign that his intervention was landing, and when none came, he walked away. That was the second mistake. That was when he decided the documentation phase was over. The mandatory staff meeting was called for 1900 hours the next evening. All nurses and resident physicians gathered in the conference room, the fluorescent lights humming their particular frequency, a sound that made Katie's teeth ache from years of institutional fluorescent hum in places that weren't hospitals. Pierce stood at the front of the room, his hands folded, his expression grave. "We're implementing new protocols effective immediately," he announced, his eyes finding Katie across the room, his smile sharp as a surgical blade. "Any nurse who questions a medication order from an attending physician must now obtain dual signature approval from both the charge nurse and the supervising resident before raising concerns. This is to prevent confusion and maintain clear lines of clinical authority." The other nurses shifted. They understood what he was actually saying. He wasn't implementing a rule. He was implementing a cage, and Katie Morrison was the only one inside it. What they didn't know was that Katie had already made a phone call 2 days earlier, during her break, sitting in her car in the parking lot with her phone pressed to her ear and her eyes on the Norfolk skyline. The VA fraud hotline had answered on the second ring, and she'd reported the pattern she'd found: brand-name medications ordered for veteran patients, generics delivered, insurance claims submitted at premium pricing, a rotation that looked deliberate once you knew to look for it. The woman on the phone had asked for specific examples, and Katie had given them in the measured tone of someone providing testimony, patient names, and medication codes and dollar amounts, and then she'd hung up and sat in the stillness of her car, knowing that investigations moved slowly, that bureaucracy operated on its own timeline, that Petty Officer Webb didn't have weeks. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum, that particular electrical sound that lives underneath everything in hospitals, and nobody moved, nobody spoke, because they all understood that something had just shifted in the available world. The fluorescent lights buzzed their particular electrical frequency, the one that lives underneath everything in hospitals, underneath the beeping monitors and the ventilators and the soft shuffle of night shift footsteps. Katie had been checking on Webb every 30 minutes since 2100 hours, a rhythm that looked like normal patient care to anyone watching, standard ICU rounds, appropriate nursing intervals, but it was something else entirely. It was vigilance. It was the muscle memory of someone who had learned long ago that the difference between alive and dead often measured itself in minutes, sometimes in seconds, and that the people who noticed first were the ones who saved lives. At 0300 hours, she pulled the pulse oximeter reading and her jaw tightened. 78% oxygen saturation. The supplemental oxygen was running at 5 liters per minute, the standard non-rebreather mask fitted across Webb's face, and his saturation should have been climbing. Instead, it was drifting downward like a sinking ship, incremental and inevitable. She checked the tube position. The ventilator was steady. No obvious kink in the oxygen delivery line. She ran through the diagnostic checklist in her mind, the same checklist she'd run through 17 times in a field hospital in Tikrit, in a concrete building with no air conditioning and mortar rounds impacting in the distance, back when her hands held equipment names instead of nursing credentials. Pneumothorax. Pulmonary edema. Tension physiology. The body's signals were specific if you knew how to read them. Webb's breathing had changed. That was the first thing, the detail that existed at the edge of perception, the kind of thing that most nurses would attribute to sleep apnea or normal rest patterns. But Katie heard it like a sniper hears the whisper of wind through vegetation, relevant, threatening, specific. His respirations were becoming labored, the inhale longer than the exhale, his chest moving with the kind of effort that came from his body working against something inside itself. She leaned closer and looked. The intercostal muscles in his chest were retracting with each breath, pulling inward in that distinctive pattern that meant increased work of breathing. And then she saw it. The trachea. Visibly deviated to the left, like someone had taken the tube inside his chest and twisted it as if wringing out a towel. Tension pneumothorax. The room didn't change. The monitors kept their rhythm. The 4 pumps hummed their steady infusions. But something inside Katie shifted into a different frequency, a frequency she thought she'd left behind in Tikrit, the one that came from understanding with absolute certainty that someone was dying in front of you and that the next 90 seconds would determine whether they lived or died. She pressed the call button for Dr. Pierce. Once. Her voice steady, professional, the voice of a nurse reporting a clinical change. Dr. Pierce, I need you in room 3B. Now. She pressed it again at 0305 hours. And again at 0310. The paging system crackled with overhead announcements, a discharge order, a dietary consultation, the pneumatic whoosh of the tube system sending a specimen to the lab. The hospital went about its business while Webb's oxygen saturation dropped to 72% and his lips began to turn blue at the edges, that pale cyanotic blue that looked almost serene until you understood it meant his cells were beginning to die of starvation. The resident on call, a 4th-year medical student named Torres, sharp on academics, paralyzed in crises, arrived at 0318 hours, still buttoning his white coat as he approached the bed. He was competent on paper. Katie had seen his notes. Thorough histories, appropriate medication reasoning, solid clinical judgment in the kinds of situations that existed in textbooks. But he looked at Webb and froze, his hand hovering over the patient's chest as if proximity to the problem would somehow clarify the diagnosis. He turned to Katie. I'm thinking, anxiety? Sometimes post-operative patients experience tracheal deviation, Katie said. Her voice was still that professional register, the careful register of someone reporting facts. To the left. Respiratory distress. Decreasing oxygen saturation. 272. Torres's eyes moved back to Webb's chest and his expression shifted into the particular helplessness of someone watching a puzzle they couldn't solve. He reached for the phone on the wall. I'll call cardiology. Maybe an EKG? Sometimes the electrolytes. Katie was already moving toward the crash cart. Not running would cause questions, would create a narrative, but moving with the kind of directed precision that came from having done this exact calculation 17 times before. In Tikrit, the calculations had been compressed in 2 seconds. Now they stretched into this terrible extended moment, this gap between the present and the disaster that was arriving at the speed of cellular chemistry. The crash cart sat in the corner of the ICU like a promise you never wanted to keep. Inside it, in the 3rd drawer, was a 14-gauge angiocath needle. The needle that would take maybe 60 seconds to deploy, find the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line, push through the chest wall, listen for the hiss of air that meant you just saved someone's life, tape it down, get the follow-up imaging, have the chest tube placed. 60 seconds. Webb had maybe 90 before his hypoxia became irreversible, before the damage to his brain and his organs became permanent. Dr. Pierce arrived at 0324 hours, walking without urgency, his expression already arranged into the kind of dismissive evaluation he reserved for the night shift residents and nursing staff. He glanced at the monitor readout. He examined Webb for 94 seconds, Katie counted, his hands moving with the kind of clinical surface awareness that meant he was going through the motions while his mind was somewhere else. Chest X-ray and cardiology consult, Pierce said. He wasn't asking. He was prescribing the failure to recognize what was happening, the cascade of interventions that would take 45 minutes while Webb had 6 minutes at best. Get a portable film. Someone contact the on-call cardiologist. And Torres, next time you encounter something outside your training scope, page me the first time, not the fifth. Torres nodded, already reaching for the phone. Pierce stepped into the hallway. Katie saw his profile as he moved past the glass partition of the nurse's station, saw him pull out his phone, saw his expression shift into something harder and more purposeful. She heard fragments because she was following him into the hallway on the pretext of retrieving Webb's chart, and his voice was low but carried the particular force of someone building a case. Contacted her nursing school, yes, discrepancies in her 3-year employment gap, impossible timeline, board investigators arriving Monday morning, she's been feeding information to someone, yes, I'm certain of it. He was on the phone with the hospital administrator. Maybe the board of nursing. Maybe both. He was converting Katie's fraud report into a weapon against her, spinning the timeline of her career, making her background into something that looked like a cover instead of what it was. He was very good at this, very competent at the strategic dismantling of people who threatened his position. But that competence was about to become irrelevant. Webb's oxygen saturation hit 68% at 0327 hours. The monitor alarm escalated into the kind of insistent wailing that makes your brainstem recognize danger. The red alert. The code blue threshold. Torres came running, and then, finally, reality reasserted itself over procedure, and Torres's voice cracked as he shouted, "We're losing him." The whole ICU unit went into motion. Nurses flooding toward the room. The crash cart wheeling into position. Someone paging anesthesia for an emergency intubation, even though intubation would come too late, would be an act of ritual rather than rescue, because the problem wasn't the airway, the problem was the pressure. The problem was the air that had escaped into Webb's pleural space and was collapsing his lung and pushing his heart into dangerous angles. Katie stood at the edge of the chaos, her hands gripping the rail at the foot of the bed, her face exactly as composed as it had been at breakfast, her jaw exactly as steady as it had been when Dr. Pierce had publicly humiliated her 2 weeks ago. She could see Webb's face turning darker, the blue spreading like ink through water, his body beginning the terrible physical process of asphyxiation while educated people around him tried to solve the problem with diagnostics instead of recognition. She could fix this. She could move to the crash cart right now, pull the needle, find the space, second intercostal, midclavicular line, a distance she could find in absolute darkness, push through the chest wall, hear the hiss of air, and save his life in less than a minute. She could do what her hands had been trained to do, what her muscle memory screamed to do, what everything she had learned in 13 years of military medicine knew how to do. But doing so would mean exposing herself. It would mean admitting to a skill set that didn't match her nursing credentials. It would hand Dr. Pierce the narrative he was already constructing, the ammunition he was already loading into the chamber. It would be the moment when Katie Morrison the nurse ceased to exist and Captain Katie Morrison the war criminal, or the hero, or whatever they decided to call her, would become visible to every administrator and board member and investigator in Norfolk. She could watch Webb die. She could stay composed. She could say nothing. She could survive. Or she could save him and stop surviving. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Not hesitation. Not decision. Just the geometry of survival taking over, muscle memory pulling her toward the crash cart like a compass finding north. The needle decompression kit was in her fingers before she'd consciously crossed the room, her body remembering 100 field saves that her nursing license didn't officially know about. Webb's oxygen sat had flatlined at 71%. His lips were turning the color of old bruises. His trachea was deviating. She had 90 seconds. Nobody stopped her. That was the thing, in a real code, in that 3-second window where everyone else was still processing, the person moving with absolute certainty just became part of the landscape. Katie tore open his hospital gown with one hand while locating the second intercostal space with the other, her fingers reading his ribs like braille, counting down from the clavicle with the precision of someone who'd done this in a Tikrit field hospital with mortar fire 200 meters away and no anesthesia and a kid who'd taken shrapnel through both lungs. One space. 2 spaces. Midclavicular line. That's where the trapped air was screaming to escape. The 14-gauge catheter slid between his ribs like it was meant to be there. Not a hesitation. Not a tremor. Just a captain's hand doing what a captain's hand did when people were dying. The hiss came immediately. Unmistakable. The sound of a tire deflating, the sound of pressure releasing, the sound of death stepping backward. Webb's oxygen saturation climbed from 71 to 89 in 40 seconds. 82. 85. 89. His color returning from the gray-blue of hypoxia to the pink of someone who was going to survive. His trachea shifted back to midline. His eyes opened. He gasped, a real breath, not the desperate drowning gasp of 3 minutes earlier. He was alive because Captain Morrison had moved when the attending froze and the resident looked like someone trying to solve an equation in a language he didn't speak. The nursing staff watched through the glass partition of the ICU. 12 witnesses. The entire night shift had stopped moving. The heart monitor resumed its steady beeping. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Webb's blood pressure climbed, 98/62. 102/64. The numbers moving in the right direction. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, his face a study in the stages of rage. White first, the shock of watching someone else make the save that would have taken him 45 minutes of diagnostic imaging and useless interventions while Webb coded out. Then red, spreading up from his neck like someone had pulled a release valve on his composure. His hands trembled, but not from fear. From fury. From the understanding that Captain Morrison had just saved a patient's life and simultaneously dismantled his authority in front of a room full of witnesses who now knew that the attending had frozen, the resident had failed, and a nurse, had done what doctors couldn't. He didn't speak to her. That was the most chilling part. He just turned and walked to the elevator, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped at his temple. Within 90 minutes, Katie was sitting in Administrator Ellen Vance's office on the 4th floor, the air conditioning humming with the particular cold efficiency of institutional spaces designed to deliver bad news. Dr. Pierce was already there, his composure reassembled like he'd glued it back together during the elevator ride. 2 board members were on speakerphone, their voices crackling through the office speaker with the authority of people who didn't have to be present to destroy a career. She performed an invasive procedure without physician oversight, Pierce said, his voice-controlled fury wrapped in clinical language. Without consulting the attending. A clear violation of scope of practice. Practicing medicine without a license. I've contacted her references, or attempted to. He opened a folder, Katie's personnel file spread across Administrator Vance's desk like evidence. Her nursing license is 3 years old. Current RN, current CPR, all credentials valid. But her resume claims 10 years of medical experience. 10 years. Yet the employment history shows nothing. No verifiable positions. No hospitals that will confirm dates. No work history that connects the dots between her license date and her claimed experience. It's as though someone simply erased the first 7 years. Katie sat motionless. Not a flinch. Not a waver. Just her hands folded in her lap, her breathing even, her face the blank professional mask she'd worn for 3 years. Defending herself would require an explanation. An explanation would require admitting that Captain Captain Morrison, United States Navy, had spent 7 years conducting combat medical operations under a call sign that officially never existed. That she'd trained personnel in field protocols that were still classified. That her missing work history was locked behind Pentagon encryption and national security orders that carried felony penalties for disclosure. She said nothing. The hospital has conducted an internal review, Administrator Vance continued, her voice almost apologetic but her hands already sliding the termination paperwork across the desk. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated pending the outcome of a formal credential investigation. The State Nursing Board will be notified. We're cooperating fully with Dr. Pierce's request for a complete background review. Katie stood. She didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She just took the folder with her personnel records and walked out of the office at 18:47 hours, knowing that by morning, her nursing license would be flagged, her background would be under scrutiny, and the Pentagon file that had been sealed for 3 years would be the thing that either saved her or buried her deeper. The hospital laundry room was empty at 2,100 hours. Row after row of industrial washers humming their mechanical rhythm, the smell of bleach and hot linen mixing into something that smelled like institutional surrender. Katie stood in front of her locker, pulling out the navy blue scrubs she'd folded every other day for 3 years. The fabric was soft from 1,000 washings, the creases wearing into permanent lines. She began folding them again, each movement deliberate and precise, crease meeting crease with the geometric efficiency of a flag ceremony. Sleeves aligned. Collar tucked. Each fold a small act of discipline, of refusing to fall apart, of maintaining protocol even as the system dismantled her. The detergent smell was almost overwhelming now, industrial, chemical, the scent of erasure. She pulled the faded unit patch from inside her jacket lining, the one she'd kept sewn there since the day she'd hung up her uniform and became someone else. Tikrit insignia. Gold thread worn down to copper in places where she'd touched it during 3 years of pretending. The patch fit in the palm of her hand, worn soft, weightless, carrying the full mass of 7 years and 17 lives saved and 2 Navy crosses and the particular gravity of being nobody at all. 3 seconds. She allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to remember what it felt like to have a name. To have a rank. To have been the person whose call sign meant something in a language only a handful of people on Earth could speak. Then she folded the patch into the corner of the scrubs, placed the entire stack in the donation bin by the door, and walked out of St. Michael's without looking back at the hallway she'd cleaned and the protocols she'd followed and the boundaries she'd maintained so carefully for 3 years. The parking lot was empty. Rain had started, hammering the asphalt like applause, and Katie stood in it for a moment, letting it soak through her civilian jacket, the nylon darkening with water. Her phone had 3 messages. One from a number she didn't recognize. One from an app that had been dormant for 36 months. One from a contact listed only as classified. She didn't open them. Not yet. But she could feel them sitting in her pocket like gravity shifting, like the world recognizing something it had officially pretended not to see. The rain came harder now, thunder rolling across Norfolk like distant artillery, and Katie Morrison walked toward her car knowing that something was about to begin. Something that would either restore Captain Katie Morrison to existence or bury her deeper than the Pentagon had ever intended. The convoy arrived at 0900 hours, not 1 vehicle but 12, moving with the coordinated precision of a rehearsed formation, black SUVs with government plates, doors opening in synchronized sequence, dress uniforms flooding through the emergency bay sliding doors like a tide of consequence that no hospital protocol could hold back. The atrium filled within minutes, staff gathering from every unit, every floor, drawn by something they couldn't name but recognized in their bones as authority made visible. The fluorescent lights hummed their usual monotone, indifferent to the shift in atmospheric pressure, but every person in that space felt it, the air itself reorganizing around the arrival of power. Katie stood near the trauma intake desk, still wearing her civilian clothes from the morning drive, still holding her termination paperwork in an envelope that felt heavier than it should, watching the uniforms move through the space with the fluid precision of apex predators who never needed to rush. A 3-star general led them, his dress blue so crisp they could cut glass, his presence making the atrium shrink around him. Behind him walked a Marine lieutenant in dress uniform, and Katie's stomach tightened because she recognized that bearing, the way he held a folder against his chest, the specific angle of his jaw that meant official proceedings. Then Webb's voice cut across the atrium, ragged and barely above a whisper, forced up from a throat still healing from the endotracheal tube they'd removed 3 days ago, Reaper. The room went dead silent. Every head turned toward the wheelchair at the atrium's center, where Webb sat with his legs under blankets that couldn't hide the thinness of him, his eyes locked across the crowd until they found Katie, and he pointed with one trembling hand. That's her. That's Reaper. Katie's jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't shake. But something inside her shifted like tectonic plates realigning, grinding against 23 years of careful erasure, and she understood in that instant that the rain from last night, the phone messages, the convoy, none of it was accident. The Pentagon had been watching. The Pentagon had been waiting. The Marine lieutenant stepped forward, his voice carrying the trained projection of someone accustomed to being heard in combat zones and auditoriums alike. He opened the folder and began to read, each word landing in the atrium like ordnance. Katie Maria Morrison. Captain, United States Navy, attached to JSOC Task Force Titan. Citation for Valor. Classified Operation, Tikrit, Iraq, March 2011. 17 lives saved under fire. Emergency field medicine under sustained hostile fire. Triage and treatment of multiple high-severity casualties in a non-permissive environment. Standard rules of engagement suspended. Medal recommendation retroactive upon declassification. The lieutenant's voice never wavered, but Katie heard the weight beneath the words, the lives saved, the 17 names that the Pentagon had kept sealed in classified files while she pushed medication carts and charted vitals under a doctor's contempt. 17 families who never knew their loved one came home because a woman in Navy scrubs made a decision in a chaos no civilian could understand. The general stepped forward, and Katie recognized the motion before it happened, the sharp movement of a man who had spent 40 years in dress uniform, whose body had learned military precision so completely it had become the only language his muscles remembered. His right hand came up in a salute rendered with the kind of formal authority that meant something was being returned, not given. He held it for 4 seconds, his eyes finding Katie across the atrium, and she understood what he was doing. He was rendering honors to Captain Morrison, the person the DoD had erased, the person only Webb and the Pentagon still knew existed. Dr. Pierce stepped forward, his politician smile already forming, the smile that had survived a dozen confrontations with complaint boards and had charmed 2 ex-wives through divorce proceedings. His mouth opened to speak, to spin this as a misunderstanding, a regulatory mix-up, something that could be contextualized and minimized and absorbed into the hospital's liability insurance. Katie watched his brain working behind his eyes, calculating angles, positioning himself as a sympathetic figure who'd simply been misinformed about a staff member's background. Dr. Pierce. The general's voice had the texture of a blade moving through water, no resistance, no effort required. You requested a credential investigation into Captain Morrison's background. Pierce's smile held. Yes, standard protocol for patient safety, I'm sure you understand. The general opened a folder. The same folder Pierce had demanded. The same investigation that was supposed to expose Katie's military background and justify her termination. But the pages weren't about Katie. The admiral's finger moved down a spreadsheet, and Katie could see the numbers from 20 feet away, columns and rows and patterns that only made sense if you understood what you were looking at. Your inquiry triggered a Pentagon security review. That review flagged irregularities. We passed those to the State Medical Board and the VA Inspector General. The general's voice remained at the same professional monotone, which made it worse, no anger, no emotion, just the steady recitation of fact like a prosecutor walking a jury through forensic evidence. Fraudulent billing scheme spanning 14 months. Brand name medications ordered and billed to veteran insurance. Generic equivalents delivered. Difference pocketed through shell company pharmaceutical kickbacks. 27 veteran patients. $187,000 in confirmed fraud. Pierce's face drained of color like someone pulling a plug from a drain. The smile didn't disappear, it froze, calcified in place, his muscles locked in a rictus that looked more like a grimace. Captain Morrison reported the discrepancy in the medication billing. The general turned another page. You subsequently attempted to terminate her employment. Before she could notice the pattern expanding. Before she could escalate through official channels. Pierce tried to recover, his voice taking on the tone of someone who'd been to depositions and understood the value of a good narrative. This is absurd, I'm a respected physician, my record. Your record is currently under subpoena. The general closed the folder. The investigation you demanded into her credentials exposed your malpractice, doctor. Your weapon destroyed you. 2 hospital security guards appeared at Pierce's elbows, not touching him, not yet, but present in the way a predator's presence is felt before teeth make contact. Behind them came a woman in a charcoal business suit, her eyes hard as ball bearings, moving with the efficiency of someone who did this work regularly. the State Medical Board investigator. She approached Pierce with a folder of her own suspension papers. Katie could read the header from a distance, effective immediately, pending criminal investigation. Pierce's eyes found Katie across the atrium, and she saw the moment his brain completed the calculation, the moment he understood that he hadn't defeated an overstepping nurse, he'd attacked a Pentagon asset, and the Pentagon protected what was theirs. His face cycled through emotions like a broken traffic light: rage, desperation, the blank stare of someone whose entire worldview had just inverted. His lips moved. "You set me up. You knew exactly what you were doing." Katie's expression didn't change. Her hands remained steady at her sides. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential tone she'd used in the hospital for the past 3 years. This was a different voice, one that had given orders in conflict zones, one that had commanded men and women through circumstances that would break most people. This was Captain Morrison's voice. "I reported a billing error." Katie's words landed like punctuation marks. "You made every choice after that." The general signaled, and 2 VA investigators appeared from the crowd. They'd been waiting in the wings the entire time, Katie realized, watching to see if Pierce would accept his termination or force them to make it visible. They moved to his elbows with a kind of calm precision that suggested they'd done this before, had collected terminated physicians and removed them from buildings while everyone watched. Pierce didn't resist. He couldn't. The social leverage entirely gone, the authority he'd wielded evaporated in the 30 seconds it took for the general to open a folder. They moved him toward the emergency bay, past the same sliding doors where he'd watched Katie save Webb's life, past the atrium where he'd publicly humiliated her in front of a patient's entire family. His hospital credentials were already deactivated. Katie saw someone at the IT desk moving with purpose, the logical cascade of termination playing out in real time. His parking pass would be revoked, his office sealed, his patient files transferred, his reputation cremated in the machinery of regulatory consequence. The State Medical Board didn't revoke licenses without absolute certainty. They had him. Multiple hospitals, multiple victims, a pattern that went beyond one fraudulent scheme into systematic exploitation. Sarah, the young nurse who'd been kind enough to listen in the break room 3 months ago before Pierce's pressure made her choose sides, started crying. Not from sadness, from recognition. From understanding that she'd been wrong about something fundamental, and that Katie had never told her she was wrong, had never held it against her. 3 other nurses who'd cleared out whenever Katie sat down during shifts, who'd made themselves unavailable for charting help, who'd chosen their careers over friendship, they now stood with their arms crossed, watching Pierce get escorted past them, and something like shame was written across their faces. Katie didn't look at any of them. Not yet. The moment wasn't about them. The moment was about the general turning back to her, his eyes carrying the weight of command, his voice carrying the specific cadence of an officer addressing a soldier after that soldier had operated in shadow for too long. "Captain Morrison, are you ready to come home?" The question didn't ask if she wanted to. It asked if she was prepared to step back into the light, to reclaim a name the Pentagon had erased, to stop existing in the margins of someone else's hospital and start existing in a space where her name meant something again. Katie's right hand came up without conscious thought, muscle memory so deep it lived in her bones. Her salute was crisp and exact, rendered from someone who'd spent 23 years wearing a uniform under civilian clothes, and she held it for the 4 seconds protocol demanded. The general returned her salute, and his eyes held recognition, not surprise, not approval, but the specific acknowledgement of one warrior looking at another, someone who understood that the bravest thing Katie Morrison had done in the past 3 years wasn't save a Navy SEAL with a needle decompression during a crisis. It was fold her scrubs in the laundry room, walk out into the rain, and wait for the Pentagon to remember her name. Some victories took years. Some victories required patience that looked like defeat. The general's hand came down, and he extended it toward her. Katie stepped forward through the crowd, the atrium parting around her like she was moving through water, like her presence alone had become something the room had to acknowledge, and took his hand. His grip was firm, his smile the first genuine expression she'd seen on any of the military personnel since they arrived. Around them, the atrium had transformed. The hospital wasn't hers anymore. She was no longer an employee. She was something far larger, a classified asset being reclaimed, a name being restored, a shadow becoming visible. "Welcome back, Captain," the general said quietly, for her ears only. Katie nodded, and in that gesture was everything she'd carried for 3 years, the weight, the waiting, the careful preservation of who she was under the weight of who everyone else had decided she should be. Someone on the edge of the crowd started to applaud, and then another, and then the atrium was filled with the sound of people recognizing something they'd sensed but never understood, that the quiet nurse with the steady hands and the measured voice had been something far more all along. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like Katie's, because heroes walk among us in the most unexpected places. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? And if you believe in the power of quiet strength, like this video. Thanks for watching.